Hearts in Atlantis is a collection of short stories during a period of American history that is clearly very dear to Stephen King's heart. You often hear that books with a really strong sense of place have the location as a character. For example, you'll often hear people say, oh, New York is like a character in this book. And that's a bit of a cliche, but this is probably one of the first books that I've ever read where it felt as though time was a character. This book is classic Stephen King. And by that, I don't mean that it's a horror story or anything like that, but I always feel like Stephen King does such a good job at bleeding in a kind of typical childhood coming of age story with the darker side of American life. Throughout all of the short stories in this book, the characters are struggling to reconcile with a world that is completely changing around them. This is a really turbulent time in American history, just full of chaos and disillusionment. You've got the civil rights era, you've got Vietnam, you've got JFK, you've got Martin Luther King Jr., Nixon, just all of these things that are happening in America in the 1960s. It's maybe the first, in more recent times anyway, major identity crisis that America goes through since the Civil War, probably, where it starts to ask itself, are we actually the good guys? Because everyone's told me we're the good guys. So what's going on? Now, don't worry. I know if you're American, even though I'm an American citizen as well, it's not very much fun to hear someone with my accent talk about turbulent times in America. You kind of get that knee-jerk reaction where you go, oh, yeah? Why don't you focus on your own country? So don't worry, I'm not going to be beating up on America or criticizing America or anything like that. I like it. I live here. I like it. But I'm going to be talking about the stories in this book and talking about some of the themes. And I'm mainly going to be focusing on low men in yellow coats. And the reason that I'm going to do that is because this is a part of my journey to the Dark Tower as I read my way through the multiverse. It really feels as though Low Men in Yellow Coats is the most interconnected. It's got the most crossover. So that's going to be my main focus, but I'll touch on the other stories in the book as well. Low Men in Yellow Coats is the first and the longest story in the collection of short stories. It's really more of a novella than a short story. It's probably about 300-400 pages, so maybe it's just a novel, honestly. It's a blend of coming of age mixed with subtle supernatural elements, not anything too crazy like sometimes Stephen King just really just goes for it with the supernatural elements. Obviously, It and Carrie and stuff like that. It's not like that exactly. It's definitely a bit more subtle. But Bobby Garfield, he's just living this normal American childhood, but then his life is turned upside down when he meets Ted Brautigan, who is the new tenant in their boarding house. I really liked Ted. He's an enigmatic figure with a hidden past, and he and Bobby kind of form a bond based on shared secrets that they have, and also a love of literature, which Ted encourages in Bobby. And as a book lover myself, all of those scenes I just really loved. As Bobby's discovering all these classic works of literature, these were some of my favorite scenes. When Bobby first gets his library card, his adult library card from his mother, I just really love this. Not to get too poetic about it, but I feel like if you're a kid that doesn't really have very much money, a library card is like a passport to 1,000 different destinations. You can step into the shoes of characters and meet people that you otherwise wouldn't have met, and go to places that you otherwise wouldn't have gone to, places that don't even exist, and you can do it all without spending any money. It's an incredible birthday gift, honestly, I think that she gives to him at that age. Discovering reading, discovering the effect that it can have on a young mind. The book does a really good job at describing that feeling and kind of capturing that feeling. I think I enjoyed the relationship between Ted and Bobby so much because it felt as though they really needed each other. Bobby has lost his father and he's living with his widowed mother, who is a complicated figure. She's got a lot of demands that are thrust upon her as a single mother. And so she can't always be available to him. It's kind of like a hard situation. Plus, she's, like I say, she is a complicated character. And so Ted is able to teach him things and to guide him through life, someone to look up to. And then I feel like the way that Ted needs Bobby is that Ted seems to come from a very dark place, and Bobby is like a reminder of the purity of the world and the goodness, and it just kind of seems to elevate him and cheer him up. So yeah, I thought that their relationship was really sweet. I actually think all the characters were really well developed. You've got Bobby, who is a young lad on the brink of adolescence. And he's at that stage of life that we're all familiar with when we start to realize that the world isn't quite, sunshine and rainbows, as they say. It's a little bit darker than that. It's a bit more complicated, a bit more dangerous than we knew it was, but also more exciting in a way. Then you've got Ted, and Ted is wise and kind and patient, but also cautious of any dangers that might be lurking around. Ted Brautigan's mysteries are revealed very slowly over time, and it just always made me curious, like, where is this guy from? What is he trying to escape? Like, what is the mystery here? And so, yeah, I was always eager to learn more about Ted. And then you've got Bobby's mother. I think her name's Liz. I could be wrong about that. And she is, as I mentioned, she's complicated, but she is, in my opinion, and I don't know if you feel the same way about her. She is a sympathetic character, just given her situation. She's lost her husband, so obviously that's traumatic. But also, she's having to make sacrifices and do things that she doesn't necessarily want to do. And it's like all of her dreams have fallen down around her, but she's still focused on protecting Bobby. But the need to protect Bobby and the need to do these things that she doesn't want to do in order to facilitate that, it's just like a cauldron of darkness, And so it's making her a bit paranoid of everyone around her. She sees danger everywhere. I couldn't help but feel sorry for her, because what I try and do when I read these things is imagine, what if this was real life. It's a little bit like how in Breaking Bad everyone hates Skylar, right? And it kind of reminded me of that. Everyone hates Skylar from Breaking Bad. But if it was real life, that's probably how the majority of people would be like Skylar. That's maybe true of Bobby's mother as well in this book. Probably from this point on, I'm going to be talking about pretty heavy spoilers. So if you haven't already read the book, scram! Get out of here. Oh, but before you go, I love you. See ya. All right, now those losers have gone, let's get down to the nitty-gritty. I love the scenes where Bobby slowly realizes that Ted is more than just some friendly old guy from out of town. He's actually got very powerful psychic abilities. And that just by being around Ted, Bobby realizes his own potential for psychic abilities, and it's almost like his abilities are heightened just by being around Ted. We find out that Ted is something called a breaker, and the first time I read that Ted was a breaker, I didn't know what a breaker was, but I know that it's tied to the Dark Tower. It's really strange, because I know that Ted is trying to break the beam, or is kind of being forced to break the beam. But Roland and the quartet know that the beam, or the beams, plural, are holding up the tower, right? And they're kind of supporting the tower. So it seems as though at this stage in my journey, I haven't completed the Dark Tower yet. So it seems as though Ted is a good guy, but he's being forced by the low men in yellow coats and the Crimson King to break the beams against his will. So that'll be interesting to see where that story leads. I liked all of the scenes with Bobby and Carol Gruber. I thought that the book did a really good job at recreating that feeling of like puppy love, a childhood crush, the innocence of it, the kind of like the purity, which in this case ultimately ends in tragedy. And I'll talk more about that when I talk about the other books, because Carol is quite an interesting character in this collection of short stories. She's kind of like always present. But yeah, in the early scenes of this book, I just felt like their affection for one another is completely devoid of any complexities or any ulterior motives. There's nothing cynical about it. It just kind of conjures up that nostalgia of childhood, and I just thought all of those scenes were really nicely written. And then it goes a step further when their innocence is kind of broken. Carol's is broken, but when she's attacked by the bullies in the town, and also Bobby's as well, when he takes the law into his hands, and goes and gets vengeance on the bullies and kind of manipulates the situation as well. He lies to law enforcement. This really, as far as I'm concerned, it kind of signifies the end of Bobby's childhood. It's the end of his innocence. And it's the moment where he doesn't just realize that the world is a little bit darker than he first thought, but he actually takes his first step into that world. Probably my favorite scene in the whole of the novella was the introduction of the low men in yellow coats. I liked all of the scenes surrounding these characters. I liked being introduced to the concept of the low men in yellow coats. These are really great villains. They're shrouded in mystery. At this point, we don't know where they're from, but we know that they're not from here. And I also like the idea that they don't quite understand how to fit in. They're trying to fit in, but the clothes that they're wearing are very obviously yellow coats, right? But they're very ostentatious. They're wearing these big hats. I imagined them looking kind of like Dick Tracy characters. They are driving around town in these old-fashioned classic cars, but the cars look brand new. And so, yeah, it's kind of what a visitor to this world would think that a human looks like. I enjoyed the idea of the low men in yellow coats, and I enjoyed actually meeting them in the later scenes. While we're on the subject of their cars, I also wonder, are their cars in some way related to Blaine the Mono? Because Blaine the Mono was neither fully creature nor fully machine. It was kind of like a mixture of both, right? And these characters, these cars rather, feel as though they are both creature and machine. It's like the body of the car is like skin. Seems as though they've got eyes and a consciousness. So yeah, I wonder if Blaine the Mono and the cars that are used by the low men in yellow coats are in some way related. I especially loved the way that they communicate with one another through missing pet posters to give each other hints of where their targets are located. And also they have chalk drawn on the pavement, and people avoid it, but they don't know why they're avoiding it. And that chalk on the pavement moment reminded me of another short story that I read. It's a short story from the book of the same name called Everything's Eventual, and I'm pretty sure that this character draws chalk on the pavement as well, and people avoid it without knowing about it. So that's got to be connected in some way. I think. I think I'll learn about that later. But But yeah, it's just so creepy, the idea that what Stephen King can do really well, and I've spoken about this before, is how he can take the mundane and everyday in our reality and kind of flip it on his head in the same way that he did a grocery store in The Mist. You know, it's just such a boring everyday location. Turning it into an absolute hellhole is really interesting, and it just gives it that extra layer of authenticity. And the same way with these missing posters, sort of missing pet posters, and the little hopscotch chalk drawings on the pavement. So now when I'm walking around and I see a missing pet poster, I kind of think, oh, low men are about. We find out in this book that the low men in yellow coats serve the Crimson King. And this is a character that I met when I read the book Insomnia. So I don't fully know who the Crimson King is, but he keeps popping up every now and then, really shaping up as the main antagonist in the Dark Tower series. The scene that made me really angry, and I think the reason that Bobby's mother will probably get a lot of hate, is when she tells the low men in yellow coats where Ted is. She does this kind of unwittingly, but it's really silly for her to do this. You know, she gets paid. I'm pretty sure she gets paid money to tell where he is. And she already doesn't like and doesn't trust Ted. So yeah, but it just drove me crazy. Like, what are you doing? Like, I understand, but you know, at this stage in her journey, she has been assaulted by her colleagues, and she's been through something absolutely horrific. So you know, you've got to keep that in mind. She's at her wits' end, and she's losing it, and she's suspicious of everyone and everything. But when we find out that Bobby's mother told the low men in yellow coats where Ted was over the phone, it's like, you know, and Bobby goes mental at her. You know, he just releases all these years of pent up fury and just unleashes it. And this, I think, is where Bobby loses the rest of his innocence. He lost some of his innocence when he beat up the bully and lied to law enforcement, and now he's just losing it with his mother, and yeah, it's like he's no longer a boy. I really love the scene where the low men in yellow coats have a standoff with Ted and Bobby outside of the corner pocket. I think it's in this scene where the low men are referred to as the regulators, which for me is a little bit confusing because obviously Stephen King has a book called The Regulators, which is my least favorite Stephen King book that I've read so far, I think. But it didn't seem as though the low men and the regulators were exactly the same. They might have had the same kind of imagery, but they didn't seem like they were the same characters. And maybe you can clear that up for me. Are the regulators the low men in yellow coats? Are they the same people or same creatures, whatever they are? Anyway, it's in this scene that we find out that Ted is something called a breaker. He quotes the all things serve the beam, so we know that his values are aligned with Roland's. His mission is aligned with Roland's, because I think we've heard Roland say a few times that all things serve the beam. This is also the scene where we find out that the low men in yellow coats serve the Crimson King. And so it's just like, this was so satisfying to me, this scene, because a lot of these books that I've been reading along the way, and I've read so many now, so many massive books. It was one of them, The Mist. I mentioned Everything's Eventual, Rose Madder, Insomnia, The Regulators, Desperation, and probably 5 or 6 others. And it doesn't always feel as though they're really deeply connected to the Dark Tower. And it's just making me so eager just to jump back into Midworld and just hang out with Roland and Eddie and Susanna and Jake and Oi. But this scene kind of made it feel worth it, you know? It felt like, I've been picking up puzzle pieces along my way, And now they're slowly starting to come together, and I'm starting to see the picture, you know? And that's just really satisfying. All of the other stories in this book, sorry, man, I didn't really care for them. You know, some were interesting. One of them was interesting to me, but the others, I just didn't really care for them. The short story called Hearts in Atlantis, which obviously the book is named after, this was my least favorite in the whole collection. I didn't care about any of the characters really. It was interesting to see Carol for a little bit older and from a different perspective. But yeah, as far as the protagonist of this story goes, can't even remember his name. Wasn't interested in him. Wasn't interested in the card game. It did feel it filled me with anxiety a little bit. I'm just thinking to myself, guys, come on, man, you got to focus. You got to focus. You got to be writing your papers, writing your essays. You're gonna flunk, and then if you flunk, you're gonna get sent to Vietnam. So yeah, that was really the only thing that I got out of it. But other than that, I didn't, for some reason, I just didn't connect with the characters. I'd say really the only other short story that I did like was Blind Willie. I like this one just because it was so surreal. And this is the story that follows, I believe his name is Willie Sherman, and he is a minor character in Low Men in Yellow Coats. He's one of the boys that's kind of involved in the attack on Carol when she's a kid. He's one of the bullies. And he just feels so remorseful of what he did to Carol and also what he did in Vietnam. He's a Vietnam vet, right? And so he's got PTSD from Vietnam. He's got remorse for what he did in his childhood, and he feels as though he is paying a kind of a penance by it's strange, right? Because it's like he actually becomes blind, and this is, I think, a psychological effect of Vietnam. But it's like at a certain time during the day, he actually does become blind, and he dresses up and becomes a completely different person, goes out begging into the street as a Vietnam vet, and then gets harassed by a cop. And this cop, oh God, I couldn't stand the cop, you know? He's so judgmental. He's so hypocritical. He's constantly accusing. He's accusing Willie of like stolen valor, which isn't true, right? Because he actually did serve in Vietnam. So that was really grating to me. And he himself didn't serve. And so he's accusing him of not serving. He's also accusing him of being corrupt and stealing money. But still, the cop wants a cut, right? So it's like, what? What are you, man? Yeah, I can't stand it when people try and take the moral high ground when they themselves are corrupt. And then in the final story, where Bobby and Carol are reunited, that's kind of bittersweet. We kind of find out through all of the other stories, through the newspaper clippings that Blind Willie has collected in a scrapbook, and just other occurrences and other stories. We get a full picture of what Carol has been up to since college, and she became part of an anti-war activist group that was led by a mysterious character with the initials RF. And it's kind of, I think, rightfully assumed that this is Randall Flagg from The Stand, and also from The Dark Tower as well. And the reason that we think that this is Randall Flagg is because Carol says, first of all, he had the initials RF, but also he taught me to go dim. and to just be able to pass through the world and have no one recognize me. So yeah, this has got to be Randall Flagg, right? But what happened was there was an explosion that was caused by Carol's group in a recruitment center. Again, we can only presume that this is Randall Flagg that did this, and Carol. I think it's kind of hinted at that Carol tried to stop the explosion. But nonetheless, she has been given the nickname Red Carol, but she's also presumed dead as well. So no one's looking for her. They all think that she just went with the explosion. But yeah, I just thought that was another really interesting tie-in. I wonder if Carol Gruber will show up later in some way connected to Randall Flagg, maybe show up in Midworld, or maybe I definitely think Ted is going to play a role. Maybe Bobby as well will show up in Midworld, and that'll be really cool, really interesting. At this stage, I'm kind of like looking everywhere, like it's all connected. It's all connected. Anyway, speaking of everything being all connected, I'm about to tell you what the next book is that I'm going to be reading on my journey to the Dark Tower. But before I do that, let's get into the ratings. I know, so starting off with the plot, I know that this is a collection of short stories and novellas, but I'm going to give the plot overall 4 stars out of 5. And that is entirely due to Low Men in Yellow Coats, which is obviously the one that I enjoyed. The characters, I'm going to give 3.5 stars out of 5. I really liked or was interested by the character Blind Willie in that short story, but mostly I just really liked Ted Brotigan. I'm hoping that we get to meet him again, maybe later down the line. It seems as though we will, if he's a breaker. I hope so. It really does feel as though he's got a role to play. Next up, settings. I'm going to give 2.5 stars out of 5. Nothing special really. It feels like every small town that these books are set in slowly become quite similar. It just all seems like Derry to me, honestly. After reading It and Insomnia, everything just starts to look like Derry. Originality, I'm going to give it 4.5 stars out of 5. I just really liked the Low Men in Yellow Coats. Again, I loved the way that they communicated. I thought that they were really an ominous presence throughout the whole of the first novella. And just in the same way that I'm looking forward to seeing Ted again, I really hope that I get to see the Low Men in Yellow Coats again. That would be pretty cool. Overall, I'm going to give this book 3 stars out of 5. If it was just Low Men in Yellow Coats, it probably would have got 4 stars out of 5. But if I'm looking at the whole book, which I think is fair to give a rating to, 3 stars out of 5. I think that the short story called Hearts in Atlantis, it was just so long, and I didn't enjoy any part of it. So I think that brought it down a whole point just by itself. And Blind Willie wasn't enough to bring it back up again. So yeah, 3 stars out of 5 overall. Now, as I mentioned before, this book was a part of my journey to the Dark Tower through the multiverse. This was book number 17 of my 23 book journey. I'm hoping to reach the Dark Tower by the end of this year. And if you enjoyed this review, I hope that you'll subscribe. But if you would like to see my review of Black House, which is next, and this is going to be book 18 of the 23 book journey, then you can click up here to see the review. As you can see, Stephen King's little head popping out there. I've already started the book, and so the review should be coming out very soon. I'm speeding through this book right now. But yeah, if you'd want to see the review, then you can click up here. Thanks so much for watching. Really appreciate it, and happy reading.